Hello, everyone, and welcome to today's webinar, Franklin American's Innovation Journey, Adopting DevOps Culture in a Modern Enterprise. Before we get started, I would like to go over a few items so you know how to participate in the event. You have joined the presentation audio using your computer speaker system by default. If you would prefer to join over the telephone, just select the telephone option in the audio pane and the dial-in information will be displayed. You will have the opportunity to submit text questions to our speakers and key Docker experts by typing your questions into the questions section of the control panel. You may send in your questions at any time during the presentation. We will also take questions at the end of the webinar. Finally, today's webinar is being recorded, and you will receive a follow-up email to view the recording. I would now like to introduce our speakers, Don Bauer, Lead DevOps Engineer, and Mike No, Senior Lead DevOps Engineer at Franklin American, and David Friedlander, Director of Product Marketing at Docker. I will now turn things over to David.
Great, thanks very much, and welcome everyone to today's webinar. I'm pleased to have Franklin American join us. I'll turn it over to Don and Mike in just a couple of minutes, but I wanted to share my thoughts on DevOps and what that means and how some of our customers are tackling that DevOps culture with Docker Enterprise. So one of the things, if you've been in the industry for any number of years, you've come across this challenge. Probably seems very familiar. It's that 80-20 rule, but it's 80% of your budget goes to maintenance. And that's probably even optimistic, some of you would say. And that's partly because of the need to maintain different systems, that we're really just focused on keeping existing systems running, the lights on, worried about building out the infrastructure, the applications, on updating them. It leaves a very little budget to do new things, to actually do innovative things. And of course, complexity is going up because there are more platforms. There are now multiple clouds to deal with, where some number of years ago, it was primarily just Amazon, and even then it was experimental. Now there are multiple different clouds out there. You have to think about new platforms emerging, new types of application architectures emerging. All of that's putting more and more demand on IT. So if you ask most technology leaders, they will tell you that they're behind in their innovation or transformation efforts. They feel like they're under pressure to do new things, but they can't. And of course, the elephant in the room is there are hundreds or thousands of apps in any enterprise, that most of you have just countless applications that need to be supported, which means enhancing them, patching them, updating them, doing deployments, operating those applications, and doing that across multiple platforms. So none of that is easy. That's really where we see a lot of companies get stuck, and they want to innovate. So they start thinking about DevOps. But of course, the operations is consuming so much of the budget, the mind share, and the life of the people trying to keep things running, that it's really hard to do more than just meet the obligations. And some of you maybe have families or parents to care for. I'm a parent to two small kids, so that means that I think about 80% of the effort is just keeping things going at home, with in the home front, and just keeping them fed and clothed and everything, and then you spend 20% of your time doing the fun things, right? That's kind of like IT. You can think of it any way you like, but what we all want to do is simplify that, and allow us to go and tackle the more critical initiatives to do the innovative things. So that's what I wanted to talk about today, and then have Franklin American share their journey. So the challenge I mentioned is that we can't just write an application and expect it to run everywhere. We have to do essentially this matrix from hell, this complexity of running things across multiple environments, multiple platforms, and even within development environment, you will have different platforms, different things to support. And hey, it worked on my machine, why doesn't it work on yours problem crops up all the time in this sort of matrix, right? And we're dealing not just with public cloud, but multiple clouds, right, which may have different requirements. We may be running in different data centers. All the different problems just multiply exponentially in that environment. And the complexity is something that we need to address. So that's where containers have come in, is, hey, we can simplify things if we have a single platform. So containers can take away that complexity. They can cut a lot of that out, because now you have this portable object. And that's how I really think about containers, is that they solve that portability challenge, because they're simple, standardized. Many of you are already familiar with it, or using it today, hopefully, in some way or another. And you know the cargo container analogy, right? That before these cargo containers, and I won't go into the long history of it, but everything was just different shapes containers, barrels, things like that. You didn't have a standard container. That makes it a lot easier when you have a standard object. Software containers are different. They're not always the same size. They have different things in, of course, different components in them. They may have, but the idea is to eliminate the different requirements for them. That you have a lightweight, portable thing that can run anywhere. But is that technology enough? Are containers enough to solve that problem? And that's where I think a lot of enterprises they start with let's containerize it and everything will be better, right? That if we just do that, we went down this path with virtualization. I spent years in the virtualization industry and that side of it, and storage, and we went down that same path of trying to just solve it by throwing technology at the problem. And so, as Scott Hanselman, who's a DevOps thought leader, said that one of the most powerful things we have as developers or as operations people is automation. And of course, that's in part a technology. It's very much technology, and people approach it that way. But of course, if you automate too much, you end up with, my daughter's room. It's actually not my daughter's room, but I would expect to see other mixes of toys in there. But after an hour of play, the room looks something like that. So you automate a mess, you get an automated mess. Right? That's where you end up. So how do you overcome that? And that's what Franklin American's been doing with their initiative, their innovation initiative, and bringing DevOps into what is, admittedly, mortgage is a traditional enterprise. If you've ever taken out a mortgage, it's like 300 pages of paperwork you have to sign. It's getting better, right? And the servicing of that is getting better, and that's thanks in part to technology, but there's also a lot of process that has to come behind that. So when I think about DevOps, and I'm sure Don and Mike would agree with this, that it's not by itself, it's not a goal, it's not a technology you can deploy. It's really a never-ending process of continual improvement, right? That's what you're going after, is trying to get that process improvement. So I'll turn it over here in a second to Don and Mike. I just wanted to highlight what they're doing and what they've been doing. We first started working with Franklin American in 2017, and they really approached us from the idea of, we need to innovate, but we can't innovate within the existing structure and processes of our organization. So they actually established an innovation group to work outside of that, to make no assumptions about what was possible, what was not possible, to not have the constraints of operations of the existing IT infrastructure, and what could we do? How could we do better? How could we build new things? And you could approach it from, let's modernize what we have, but also from what could we do new and different? What do we not think of that we can now do? And so that was really where they got started. And the result now and going forward, and they'll talk a little bit about this, is that not only did they build those, but they are able to deploy applications much faster. They're able to handle a lot more business as a result, more efficiently, and really do that at a greater scale, and without driving up costs or hiring a whole bunch of people, which is really one of the other key things. Of course, you can't take on more operational costs. And they're able to just take new ideas, as Sharon Fraser, who's the VP of Innovation there, said at DockerCon, from start to finish within a week. They could evaluate them, and they may not end up deploying them, but that evaluation cycle and just trying to see if they could make it work cycle was very fast compared to what they used to do. So with that, I'm going to go ahead and turn it over to Don and Mike to tell you a little bit more about what Franklin American is doing. I'm going to go ahead and pass the presenter ball to you guys.
All right.
All right,
Well,
done.
well, thanks for all that, David. Really appreciate it. So yeah, now that we're getting into the meat of this, our talk here is called "Adopting DevOps Culture in a Modern Enterprise," and we'll cover a great deal of what David just spoke about. So we'll do some introductions first. My name's Don Bauer. I am the lead DevOps engineer for Franklin American Mortgage. I am a Docker community leader here in Nashville, Tennessee, where we're based. And the positions that I've held throughout my career have involved almost every portion of development and operations positions. And I've worked in communications, agriculture, construction, and now finance, but all on the tech side. I've got my co-presenter here, Mike No.
I'm Mike No, No Mike on Twitter, and I am working on the continuous delivery and automation here at Franklin American with Don and DevOps. I am the resident DevOps apostle, which means I'm the one screaming the loudest about how we do these things and how we get them done and how we need to be more DevOpsy, I guess. Father of four, which means I'm used to being busy constantly, and a U.S. Army veteran, which means I know how to deal with stress.
So this webinar is a continuation of a talk that myself and our VP over Innovation, Sharon Frazier, gave at DockerCon in San Francisco. That talk is titled Disruption from Within, and the links for that presentation will be provided by David at the end of this webinar, so you can pull all those up. And then a shameless plug here, but Mike and I will also be speaking in Barcelona at DockerCon Europe on migrating services to Kubernetes. So if you find yourself in that area in December, be sure to hit us up. So before we start diving into processes, I did want to give a little bit of an overview of our stack and what we're using to accomplish this. So the first thing, of course, is Docker. We are running Docker Enterprise Edition, and the reason we chose Docker Enterprise Edition is it gave us the flexibility to run our applications and services anywhere. The portability that David just covered. And the biggest thing with that is alleviating that phrase, "it works on my machine." With Docker, we're able to guarantee that the services we build into these images will run the same way everywhere, whether we're running them on our local machine or our on-prem data center or any of the cloud providers that are out there. The other big thing with the modern releases or the later releases of Docker EE is we now also have the choice between orchestrators, between Swarm and Kubernetes. So that's definitely been a huge shift, and we're definitely using that to our advantage.
We use GitLab CI/CD tools as our source control and for our build deploy process. It's really simple. It works really well with Docker, and it just makes our lives easier as we transition from the legacy stack to the new stuff.
For our continuous integration and delivery pipelines, we're also using GitLab CI for that with GitLab Enterprise Edition, and that's helped us to streamline our build and deploy processes with the config being stored in the project repo, so it's subject to the same scrutiny and auditing as any other code change. Our favorite thing is that it actually uses Docker in Docker for all pipeline stages that are being executed. So we get that extra level of isolation. We don't have to worry about malicious code or anything like that might have been pulled in from a public container that we haven't vetted yet or anything like that. And the other really cool thing about it is GitLab for our company actually runs as a container on one of our Docker clusters.
And finally, we use Ansible for all of our backend automation. This handles all of our basic workflows and orchestration throughout the enterprise.
Ansible's been pretty pivotal in our legacy adoption of our DevOps culture, and Mike will touch on that here in just a little bit. But it's what's allowed us to automate things like how we did all of our legacy deployments with virtualization and VMware and so on. But I'll let Mike touch on that here in just a little bit. So the next thing is just a super quick overview of our services. I can't get into too many details, but I can tell you that across our enterprise, we've got services running in nearly every modern language. With Docker, we're able to standardize how any of these services written in any of these languages are deployed to any environment at any time. So whether it's written in Perl or Ruby or Java or PHP or any of the other things you see on your screen, we were able to standardize the delivery of those things. So now let's start talking about DevOps. So the biggest thing that we've encountered in our DevOps journey is DevOps as a term means something different to every organization. DevOps is way more than just simply automating the software development lifecycle and simplifying remedial tasks. For us, DevOps is about breaking down the barriers, removing teams from their silos through active communication and collaboration. We want the developers to be thinking about the operations and the security behind their applications when they build the next big thing, rather than having them become an afterthought and something that happens in the 11th hour. I personally feel that if a DevOps team does achieve true success, then there will be no longer a need for DevOps. But luckily for all of us as DevOps engineers, technology is moving so fast that we constantly have new and exciting challenges pretty much every day.
As far as our foundations go, we found this quote in the DevOps Handbook foundation chapter in the intro that we love, and this really sort of solidifies how we handle our day-to-day operations. And I'll just read this to you real quick. In order to create fast and reliable flow from dev to ops, we must ensure we always use production-like environments at every stage of the value stream. Furthermore, these environments must be created in an automated manner, ideally on demand from scripts and configuration information stored in version control and entirely self-service without any manual work required from operations. Again, that comes from the DevOps Handbook Foundations chapter. And this is just a real key part of how we make decisions going forward with our systems.
So as we started, and as David had mentioned, this is a continuation of a talk that we gave at DockerCon in San Francisco earlier this year, and this slide's actually directly from that talk. So in our DevOps journey, we identified some key things that we wanted from our new processes, and as a result, we made those the pillars of our DevOps vision. And those pillars, as you see on the screen here, are visibility, simplification, standardization, and experimentation. And they're now not only the pillars of our vision, but the pillars of our culture, our DevOps culture here within Franklin American. These pillars drive the decisions that we make when we're moving forward with any project within our IT ecosystem. And the culture surrounding them is now spreading across all segments of the organization, which is what we're actually here to talk about today. More details on these pillars and the details behind each and every one of them can be found in the presentation that we gave at DockerCon, and it'll be shared at the end of this talk as well. So when we came to spreading this culture across the rest of the organization, and not just the innovation team that we stood up to figure out how to do things differently, the one thing that became very, very apparent was we needed to think about teams differently. So traditional enterprises often have teams that are broken into silos, and the communication between those teams quickly becomes a bottleneck, not only for innovation, but delivery of software and services in general. In organizations with these traditional silos, things like security and operational needs and configuration management needs often become afterthoughts once the development is complete, rather than being baked into the process. So we wanted to take a different approach. First thing, we needed to take our teams out of the silos and get everyone working together. With that, we created cross-functional teams. So we had teams made up of operations engineers, architects, developers, security engineers, and when needed, a project manager or a product owner. And this allowed the team to work together throughout the entire process, which fostered additional growth and knowledge sharing and made everybody aware of everything that was going on at every point in time. Everyone's engaged and working on the same problem at the same time. So traditional problems like communications breakdowns and throwing troubles over the fence fell to the wayside. So now that I've kind of talked about where we've been, I'm going to go ahead and hand it off to Mike No, and he's going to discuss some of our newer processes and really what we wanted to get out of our culture.
Good afternoon, everyone. Thanks, Don. Like I said, I'm Mike, and I'm going to talk a little bit about sort of how our culture came to be through our processes and policies. And like DevOps, culture is one of those things that can be defined in any number of ways. So for us, step one was just defining what culture meant to us internally. And simply put, that means we wanted to drastically reduce our individual workloads and help manage work while simultaneously improving flow, automation, testing, delivery, and all those good things that we love about what DevOps are about reducing work for us. The very first thing that we do is we begin with the end in mind, and this is critical for any project. And if you've ever read like the 7 Habits of Highly Successful People, or even the Phoenix Project or the Goal from Dr. Eliyahu Goldratt, you'll know that this is something that they talk about a lot. And so for us, what this basically meant was defining specifically what it is we wanted from each product. And then making sure that each team understood that their goal was to support this product in its end state, right? Not just do the dev work or do the testing or do the delivery, but literally everybody's goal becomes support this process in production. After you've done that, you identify the value stream. This is a really key point because it makes sure that you understand, that every team understands, or every person in this process understands where the idea came from and what its ultimate end game is going to be, like which service it's going to live on, which whether it's a cloud provider, on-prem, or whatever, anything like that. Everything needs to be identified there, and that will make step 3 a lot easier. Understand the business decisions. As you know, developers or engineers, if we understand why the business is making these decisions and we're a part of those decisions, then we can provide better solutions, right? They may come up with us and say, we want this product to do X, Y, and Z, right? Well, we say, well, you know, we can already do that with A, B, and D. You know, we can help them win by making sure that we're a part of that process. And finally, remember the goal. You know, we talked about the book, The Goal from Dr. Eliyahu Goldratt, or the Phoenix Project from G. Kim and folks. But the biggest thing is remember that the goal of any organization is to make money. Our goal is to help that organization succeed. So we use a couple of these theories and philosophies that sort of center around our pillars, right? Don talked about the pillars earlier, about visibility, simplicity, experimentation. We take a lot of those from these other theories and these other philosophies, like the theory of constraints. And so part of the problem is identifying the bottleneck and then exploiting the bottleneck. Well, in our case, some of that bottleneck was communication, right? So how do we exploit that? How do you make sure that the flow matches the demand from the market when it's something like communication? So it's just, that's part of the process. We would identify the constraints, exploit them, subordinate them, elevate, and continue on. Most of you have probably seen this before, so I'm not going to get too deep into it. Systems theory is another philosophy that we follow, where the idea is that we want to measure everything across the entire system. And that begins with single piece flow, right? The idea is to, and with Docker helps us do this really well, right? Because we can put each service in a single container and redeploy that exact container again and again and again, right? And we can build those pipelines with containers and make that part of the theory. Docker allows, the biggest thing about this is, pushing all these systems to production is that nothing matters until it's in production. We know from, Jez Humble and Dave Farley, that tell us in continuous delivery that no matter how good our products are, no matter what we have to offer, it doesn't matter until the customers can actually get to it. Early testing, often. These are two things that we apply constantly to our pipelines. The earlier you catch a bug, obviously, the cheaper it is to fix it. And that's a huge part of how we make decisions here. Shorter feedback loops, constantly trying to create shorter feedback loops, create more feedback loops from different perspectives and different components, and helping us create that faster flow. Culture through policy. These are some of the policies that we've instituted to help sort of instill organizational discipline across the enterprise. You'll know one of the hardest things about people is just finding the discipline to do what's right. And so we found that if we take sort of a carrot stick approach to it, we can help our engineers and our devs make better decisions about what those things are that they're doing. That helps us get closer to our goal. And so one of those is requiring automated pipelines, requiring automated builds, testing, deployments through every piece of the stack. And being able to refuse any product or application that does not meet these requirements. And this is something that you need to get buy-in from, from everyone. This will be one of the things we talk about in that slide coming up. Documentation is one of the hardest things to do, as well as discipline, but we know it is absolutely important getting the information back to the people that it matters to. In some cases, our documentation is automated, where either Ansible or Docker is spinning out information back to Confluence for maintaining those types of information. Finally, make sure that you have a way of setting up improvements for your teams, your organization. We follow a 2-week plan, do, check that cycle, where basically means that at the beginning of every 2 weeks, we decide that we want to improve at least one thing over the next 2 weeks. And it may be something small like changing how we do a deployment step, or maybe adding another notification somewhere that we missed in an earlier deployment. But it's just something small to make sure that you're constantly moving forward towards the goal. I love this little picture. Who wants change? Everyone. Who wants to change? No one. This always makes me laugh a little bit because people are sort of adverse to change, and I think it's our job as innovators and disruptors to make sure that we help them change and we help them learn that change is good, change is inevitable, but can also be fun. This slide's called Be Courageous, mainly for these points here. A lot of this is not going to be easy. Sometimes it will be so difficult you just want to go home and hang your head, but you got to get back up and learn to challenge these issues. Inertia is a big thing that we talk about, just because it's, people going to get into that routine of doing the same thing again and again and again, and you have to help them understand that there's a better way. Some people just won't believe you that this stuff works, and I think the hardest part to make this happen is if you don't have the support, if you don't have your executives and your engineers everybody on the same page, understand that this is what we want to do. It's going to be really difficult for 1 or 2 people to make this happen across an organization.
Yeah, and I think the important thing to call out here is, change is one of the bullet items under this slide, and we don't want change for change's sake. There should be a measurable improvement behind anything that we're introducing, and once you can do that, you can prove why the change is important, and that's huge in getting adoption, which removes things like lack of support. So with all that, we did want to give some stats on kind of where we were and where we are now. So before we started adopting this culture across the organization, we were doing on average 10 major deployments to production annually. So that's 10 deployments a year. And when it comes to non-production, so you're talking your testing and staging environments, we were only doing 1 to 2 non-production deployments every week. Where today, with Docker, with these updates to our process, with this new culture getting picked up by a number of other members of the organization, we are now doing 2 to 5 production deployments daily. And we do roughly 500 non-production deployments weekly. And there are certainly peaks and valleys in that number. We've had weeks where we've gone over 1,000, and we've had weeks where we've only done 100. But if you average it out, since we started doing this, it comes out to about an average of 500 non-production deployments weekly. And the other biggest improvement, and it was mentioned in the foundation slide with that call out we had from the DevOps Handbook. We can now offer self-service sandboxes for developers, and that includes not only our Docker stack but also our legacy stack as well. And that's been a huge improvement for getting some of this culture across. So before we turn it back over to David and let him close this out, and then we'll be available for a Q&A session. We did want to just give a quick summary, basically the TLDR slide, if you will, of the presentation. So first thing, identify your value stream.
Remember the goal.
Simplify your processes.
Create clear, well-documented standards.
Automate what you can.
Make small, incremental improvements. And don't give up.
So with that, I think we will turn it back over to David from Docker, and he's gonna just run through a couple more things and bring up some of those slides that I had mentioned before, and then we'll be open for Q&A.
Great, thank you guys for that. And as you guys said, sorry, I'm on the wrong slide, but as you guys said, it's very much about not just about technology. It's about process and culture, and that is very central to how we work with customers and how we think about the universe. And what I always see is that it's the container strategy is more than just individual containers, right? It is what Don and Mike just talked about, and it is about process. It is about culture. It's about convincing others to do that. There's a lot of things that you're taking this technology and this process well beyond just the operations team or just infrastructure or just development. You're really trying to permeate the organization with a process that makes it work, right? It doesn't work if you don't get those other pieces right. And that's where we see a lot of customers or people try to approach container technology and maybe not get as much out of it, maybe fall flat. So we feel that it just requires more than that. And to support that, you need things like security and governance. You need orchestration. You need automation. They talk a lot about automation. And you need training, support, certification. You're learning new skills, new ways to do things. All of this is important because we found that, and this was according to IDC, 85% of apps that are already containerized are in production, meaning some of those are really important. They're mission critical. And so you need to go beyond just technology, right? You wouldn't just, I fall back on this because I worked at VMware for a number of years, but you wouldn't just run production apps on the SXI. You'd have all of vSphere around it, right? So it's the same sort of thing. You think about process. You're deploying differently. You're working differently. You're actually structuring your organization differently. And so that for us is super important. It really we think about it as an enterprise container platform that supports all of those things. And if you'll indulge me for just a minute, this is really my short pitch about why Docker is such a good fit for this. It's such a great fit, and why you need to actually think about the platform, but also the process behind it and the culture behind it that you need to have in place. And so we're trying to really help with customers, not just here's technology, deploy it, but how do you actually get this into the enterprise? How do you start to containerize the right apps? How do you identify the right ones? Should it be your older apps, your apps that are running on Windows 2008 that are going to be out of support in a little over a year? Or is that the right place to start? Should you start somewhere else? Should you start by building new apps? There's all kinds of considerations. So Docker Enterprise really is that that container platform. It's the only one that supports all the different platforms out there. Everything, every cloud, every major cloud provider. You can run on VMs. You can run on any operating system, including Windows. You can containerize Windows apps. So all of those are critical to really to choice in the enterprise. And then of course you can do different things with it. And these are just different ways customers are using the technology, or how they're taking advantage of it, whether it's traditional apps or more microservices based, as Franklin American has started with, even taking big data applications like GSK does, with their big data team, and doing analytics on essentially on genomics data, on clinical trials data, to really drive that and improve that process. Or Azure IoT, or other use cases we see. Lindsay Corporation, a pretty big company you probably haven't heard of, but if you've ever driven by a farm and see those huge irrigation systems that are moving across the fields really slowly, watering, that's theirs. They have IoT-enabled systems that they're trying to use to save water, so they're using Docker Enterprise as part of that process to improve their software. So there's lots of different ways that customers use it, but it all comes back to the process behind it, and then being able to really have that portability and free yourself from being tied down to particular platforms that are going to, or particular tools that are going to now, or that are going to keep you in that sort of maintenance mode that we talked about before. And really, I mean, if you're looking at containerizing, obviously biased my view is working in Docker, but we think that really it's about three things. It's really about choice, about being able to choose the platforms you run on, to work with your existing apps and new apps, and being able to deploy them where you want. It's about agility, which is really about speed, and the ability to do things quickly and confidently. And then and security, which comes into the domain of both the secure software pipeline, but also the beyond that, the ability to manage the software securely, the compliance, all of those things. We have FIPS 140-2 certification we announced recently. So make sure you have a secure platform. So I talked about a couple of things on this slide, but it's essentially just repeating what I said. So with that, what I would like to do is just point you to a couple of resources that we'll skip the journey part, but just coming to a couple of resources that I mentioned before, that Don and Mike mentioned, and I can post these in the chat so that you can copy the links, and we'll send the slides out after as well. But one thing you might want to check out is Don and Sharon Fraser from Franklin American presented at DockerCon in San Francisco in June, and so there's a link here to that. There's actually a blog post, but the session is linked from there, the video, and you can grab the slides as well. And then lastly, a couple of resources from Docker. You can certainly just look at our overall resources, a couple of different white papers and books, and check out our ROI calculator. And if you're looking to get an assessment of where you are with containerization, we can certainly help you with that. You can sign up for that online. It looks like we have a couple of good questions coming in, so I'm going to put our contact info up here, and that'll, if you do want to follow up with us directly, you can ping us on Twitter, or of course email us, we're always happy to answer any questions. Let me start with a couple of the questions that are coming in right now. Someone asked a little bit earlier, and I think I answered this in text. Is Docker and Docker still supported? And yes, it is. It's actually how we do our hosted trial. So we use it to let customers try out the technology to begin with. So that's definitely supported in Docker Enterprise.
And David, if it helps any, I can verify that from our side. We're running several different versions of Docker Enterprise on our end. Everything so far is 2.0 or later, and we've been running the 2.1 beta for quite some time now. And that was just released today, which we're super excited about. But our Docker and Docker workflows have continued to work 100% as expected. Since the day we implemented them about a year ago.
Great. Yeah, that's good to hear. And I know the folks at Baker Hughes, GE, an oil and gas services, field services company. It's a division of GE. Everything partially owned by GE does that. They talked about it at DockerCon as well. They have very strong belief in simplification and their software in Docker, and Docker was one of the things they did as well. So a couple other questions. I think some folks are asking how to get started. I can post a few links to resources in the chat. There are definitely resources on our community site and on our website that can help you learn. And then if you're looking to bring this into your organization, just how do you approach that? I think certainly the example of what Don and Mike have done at Franklin American is great, and how they approach that. But I'll post a couple of links to the community site, the general places to start. There's lots and lots of people who are very big advocates of Docker, of containerization in general, of DevOps out there that you can certainly talk to. And feel free to follow up if you have specific questions about that with us too. Don and Mike, I think this is for you. How long did it take to actually implement the DevOps culture across the organization? I know you started with Docker in 2017, but I don't know when the DevOps journey really started.
Right. So like you'd mentioned in your recap at the beginning, and I briefly mentioned it as well. Our team kind of started, or rather, our journey started with standing up a whole new team, the innovation team here at Franklin American, and they were tasked with not only developing the next new big thing, but completely changing how we delivered and deployed that next new thing. So, that portion of the journey took about a year, and that's what we spoke on at DockerCon here in June. But the rest of that journey was rolling that same vision, those same practices out to the rest of the enterprise. And so if you look at it from that point, how do we get it from, okay, we've kind of proven in this little isolated environment that this works, to now where we're in the process of everybody coming on board and becoming a part of it. That was May, the end of May of this year, 2018 to now. So you're looking at about 6 months, but we had buy-in across the organization, which is hugely important. But with things like Docker and some of the things that we mentioned today, it's really easy to express that value and get buy-in from upper levels of organizations.
And I would say that you're never quite done with it. There's always this transition process where you're finally over the hump, but you're never totally done pushing DevOps and the practices and things that you want, mainly because this stuff is constantly changing on us. Every time that we feel like we have a handle on how the technology is supposed to work, there's something new that comes out and we're like, oh, this is a much better way of doing that thing we were doing. So I feel like that's the true spirit of DevOps, is the constant improvement process. It's not really about like a done state. It's more of a, how do you get to that? Okay, this is how we want to do the processes. This is how we want to work.
Yeah, incremental improvements are incredibly important.
Mhm.
You know, if you can make this one thing better today, you can focus on, you know, one more thing tomorrow. And if you keep moving forward that way, you'll actually make it through that list a lot faster than you would think.
Yeah, so I agree, and it's definitely an improvement process. Both you guys can probably relate to this. You know, it's like parenting. I mean, it's constantly changing, and you're constantly trying to learn what's working and what's not, and improve. And there's no end goal. I mean, other than maybe ship them off to the house successfully at 18, like get them to survive to 18, and ship them off to school or whatever they choose to do at that point, right? Get them to be independent. But yeah, absolutely. So similarly, you know, you're on this you know, ongoing journey with DevOps. What are the challenges that still come up? What's you know, what's still keeping you up at night, maybe, or just, you know, holding you back from certain improvements?
I would say the biggest challenge is still, and probably always will be, just the people. Convincing people that, you know, hey, this really does work, that this is a better way. And a lot of that's just through showing them how we've done it, and with other examples. In some cases, it means, you know, we've had to kind of like go off the rails and like do our own thing and come back like, hey, yeah, look, it really does work, even though like someone told us not to do it. So, you know, some of it's part of being like rebellious and just trying to, you know, get it through to the people in any way possible.
Yeah, no, I 100% agree with that. You know, one of the things that I emphasized at great lengths in San Francisco in June, and in several other presentations since then, is, you know, we can't be afraid of failure. So you should fail fast. You should fail often. That's the way we learn the best. And a lot of people have a hard time, you know, adopting something like this, adopting new processes and new change, because like Mike's slide emphasized, everybody wants change, but nobody wants to change. And so when, you know, when we say people are the biggest hurdle, the hardest part about getting adoption, you know, that's more or less what we're referencing, is just people's innate fear of changing. So that's definitely the hardest part. But some simple things you can do to help get past that is, you know, just set up a simple POC, or, you know, just pick one little thing, one small project. And this is what we had to do here. You know, we picked one of our smallest microservices, and in a week we completely revamped how we set up that deployment pipeline and that build pipeline for that service. And we moved it from a 100% manual process to a 100% automated process. And we were able to show the value of what we were essentially trying to sell, you know, through that. So, you know, just leading by example that way has really helped too. And then once you get familiar with the technology and stuff, I mean, you can very quickly and easily see where the benefits are.
Yeah, absolutely. So thank you for that. That's a great insight. Another questions, a couple of questions about where do I get resources, tutorials, labs. I'll post a couple of links. So just bear with me since I'm still in Q&A, but I will post those. And there are actually a lot of those online. Don, Mike, I don't know if either of you have recommendations for resources you've used for training. If there's a Docker-led course, I mean, DockerCon clearly is one of the amazing places to go. But for more self-learning and self-paced online, is there anything you've done that you found especially helpful?
I really like the Play with Docker.
It's the same thing I was just going to say.
Because that's something we point all of our engineers to. Like, if you're getting started with Docker, the Play with Docker tutorial is great. It's a really, really great way to get you know, started with Docker and understanding how to use it locally. And I understand Docker is launching or has launched the Docker desktop app. And I know that's coming soon. That'll make it a lot easier as well for people to get started. But yeah, Play with Docker is great. There's a bunch of books out there. And when it comes to like our Kubernetes stuff, we pretty much stick to everything Kelsey Hightower that he writes. So
Yeah, no, I was gonna lead with exactly the same thing. Play with Docker has been, the biggest thing that we personally have used, and that we've asked any of our other engineers, whether they're operations engineers, security engineers, or developers, to utilize in just learning the foundations and getting familiar with the technology. And it's been fantastic, because I mean you can stand up your own. Essentially, it's the same thing we were just talking about. You can stand up your own self-service sandbox, and do what you want, run your tests, run your experiments, and just kind of learn. And that's been fantastic for us, and it's pretty much what we've recommended.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, perfect. Yeah, thank you. And I know there's also, like, if you check Udemy or LinkedIn or other sites for courses, there are some self-paced courses on Docker, and then just in general, because there's different levels people come in at, and there's some Docker 101 material out there too that's good to review.
The other thing I'll throw out there really quick, and this is a shameless plug. There's lots of community meetups, lots of meetup groups for Docker as a platform and as a technology, both for the operations side and the developer side. Find a local community meetup that covers Docker and containers. Those have been tremendous resources for anybody that's actually willing and wanting to learn about any of this. That'll get you connected with experts the quickest, and people that have had months or years of hands-on experience.
Or even start a meetup. If you have questions about how to start a meetup, you can reach out to us too, and we'll help you with that.
Oh, absolutely.
Yeah, and we have a meetup program. We don't at Docker. We don't run the meetups. They're volunteers who run them, but we do have a meetup program, and where we support them and just help them make that possible. So that's a great resource. Absolutely, great idea to go check out a meetup near you. There are people probably in your area who are going through the same thing, and they may have meetups every so often. Probably have time for one or two more questions anyway. There is one here asking specifically someone thinking about building infrastructure for their dev team to then grow into other areas beyond web development and FileMaker development. Right now, what would be a good way to get our feet wet? Build physical infrastructure, or in the data center, or spin up services in the cloud. And I don't think there's a right answer to this. But my experience when you're getting started is sometimes it's harder to spin up physical infrastructure. It just takes longer if you don't have the capacity available already. And it's pretty easy to just spin up on Docker. But there's also the Docker hosted trial, right? If you wanted to see how it works, and then you can spin up some instances in your preferred cloud. Don or Mike, any thoughts on how you might advise someone to get started?
Yeah, I mean, my first thing on that is going to be, you need to decide what's most important first. And so, like, for us, that's consistency. And how we've done that is, again, standardizing our processes to build all these different applications and services into Docker containers. Because at that point, once they're in a container, whether we're running it on physical infrastructure at our location, or on our local development machines, or in AWS or Azure or anything like that, everything runs the same after that. We value consistency above just about everything else when we're putting stuff like this together. So, the infrastructure behind it, if you choose Docker, that actually becomes less important, because you can then run that thing anywhere.
Well, I think this question is more about how do they get started using Docker, and do they jump towards like a GCP or AWS? I love AWS and GCP as ways to get started with Docker, specifically because they have their own like Docker hosting platforms, and they're usually really cheap. as long as you remember to turn everything off. Like I have my own AWS account and I do pretty much all of my own development work and testing and stuff like that through AWS as a platform, mainly because I can spin things up and down as I need them and I can test when I need to. But if you're doing locally, things like Vagrant work really well. If you're on a Windows box, Hyper-V does really good with the Play with Docker tutorial. The tutorials really will take you through a lot of that stuff on how to get started and putting services and applications into containers.
Yeah, and I think as well, what I see a lot of people do, just from a consistency standpoint, is start with in their data center if the applications are there now, rather than trying to first figure out what to do in the cloud and putting applications there. If it's brand new applications, it might make a ton of sense to start in the cloud if that's where your long-term vision is. But just because you're dealing with you're dealing with fewer new things when potentially when you just start on premise, right? That's with your data center, with your existing tools. That's one argument for that. But of course, it's just if you don't have the infrastructure sitting there, you need the time to actually ramp that up. But you may not need that much to start. Okay, I think we are just up on the hour. So I apologize if we did not get to your question, but we are available. Certainly, feel free to drop us a note or contact us, and we're happy to follow up if you have additional questions. If you stay on for just a moment here, I will actually go ahead and post a couple of links to chat that we have. Since I was in the middle of had the screen share up here, I didn't do that, but I'll do that if we want to hang on for a minute there, and I'll go ahead and do that. All right, so thank you everyone very much for joining and staying with us, and thank you especially to you, Don and Mike, for joining us for the webinar and all the hard work you've done to ramp up for this and come here today and present. It was great. Thank you so much.
Awesome. Yeah. Thank you, David.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you. And, David's had this contact information up, for the last portion. Don't be afraid to reach out to any or all of us if you've got any other additional follow-up things about how to move forward. So thank you.
Great. Thank you. Thank you, everyone. Thank you, Don, Mike, and David, and thank you all for joining us today. This does conclude the webinar. And just a reminder that today's session was recorded, and you will receive a follow-up email to view the recording within 48 hours. We again thank you for joining us and hope you have a great day.
Goodbye.